A police operation in Boston takes a tragic turn when an officer is killed, but the shooter manages to escape. However, the Boston Police Department and the FBI are hot on his trail. Investigators must navigate a web of criminal activity, concealed dangers, and unforeseen obstacles to bring him to justice. Murdering a police officer is among the most serious crimes. In 1987, a man launched an attack on 2 officers, killing one of them before vanishing without a trace. He had already been on law enforcement's radar for previous assaults on police officers, and his escape led him across state lines, receiving help along the way. I'm Jim Karlstrom, former head of the FBI's New York field office. To catch this murderer, investigators had to break through his network of supporters before he could disappear forever. Boston, Massachusetts. The Back Bay District is known as one of the city's more affluent neighborhoods, with a low crime rate. But on October 2, 1987, at around 12:30 a.m., the peace was shattered. Meredith Falcone found herself in a heated argument with her cousin. The situation escalated when he threatened her. Fearful for her safety, she decided to throw him out. "Get out! I mean it," she shouted, but she knew he wouldn't leave easily. In fact, she worried he might become even more aggressive. Feeling trapped, she reached for the phone. "If you don't go, I'm calling police," she warned, dialing 911. The emergency dispatcher picked up. 911, what's your emergency? The call was recorded, as is standard. Once informed of the situation, dispatch immediately sent 2 patrol units to the scene. The first car arrived within minutes. To officers George Torres and Chris Rogers, it appeared to be a routine domestic disturbance call. "Boston police," Torres said over the intercom at the building's entrance. "Can you let us in?" Inside, Meredith tried but was having technical difficulties. "The buzzer isn't working," she explained. "Maybe the neighbors can let you in." As the officers waited, they could hear noises from inside. Something was definitely going on. Soon, 2 more officers, William Kennedy and Roy Surge, arrived for backup. None of the building's neighbors responded to the police presence, so the team had to adapt. "We followed standard protocol," Kennedy recalled later. 2 of us secured the back, while the other 2 stayed at the front. Torres and Rogers took the rear, looking for an alternate entry point. They spotted a man hiding behind a ledge in the backyard. This could be the cousin Meredith mentioned. Torres thought. "Hey, step over here," he called out. The man didn't comply. A lock gate separated them, so Torres gave a direct order. "Climb over the fence and come to me." As soon as the suspect's feet hit the ground, he bolted. Instinct kicked in. Torres grabbed him, trying to restrain him, but the man shoved him with unexpected force. A sense of dread washed over Torres. Something told him this guy was armed. Before he could react, the suspect pulled a gun and fired. Torres was hit. A second later, the suspect turned his weapon on Rogers, firing again. Then he shifted back to Torres. Rogers had no clear shot, and the situation was spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, Kennedy and Surge reached the backyard. As they closed in, the shooter fired again, hitting Surge. Despite his own injuries, Torres rushed to help his fallen colleague. Kennedy took off after the gunman, chasing him through multiple streets. But in the shadows of the Boston night, the suspect managed to disappear. As I leaned over Surge, I noticed blood soaking through my uniform, Torres later recalled. My arm, my chest, I had multiple gunshot wounds. Struggling to breathe, he realized one bullet had punctured his lung. Rogers immediately radioed for backup. "We have 2 officers down." "Repeat, 2 officers down." His voice was urgent, the weight of the moment sinking in. The city-wide alert went out. In minutes, the usually quiet Back Bay district was flooded with sirens and flashing lights. Torres and Surge were rushed to the hospital, their conditions critical. Detectives quickly arrived to gather witness statements. Kennedy and Rogers described the attacker as an athletic, medium-built Asian man in his 30s. But something didn't add up. This description didn't match Meredith's cousin, the original reason for their call. One detail stood out to Kennedy. As a trained sniper, he was confident he had hit the suspect. But oddly, there was no blood trail at the scene. Both injured officers had suffered 3 gunshot wounds each, including life-threatening hits to the chest. They were losing massive amounts of blood, and emergency teams fought desperately to stabilize them. Inside the ER, doctors rushed them into surgery. Every second counted. Meanwhile, back at the scene, forensic specialists meticulously examined the area. Bullet fragments and blood spatter painted a chaotic picture of a violent exchange. Several blocks away, a discarded pistol magazine was discovered. Investigators believe the shooter had tossed it in his escape. The magazine was empty, designed for a 9mm semi-automatic SIG Sauer pistol. If this belonged to the shooter, it could hold a critical clue. In the crime lab, analysts found a partial fingerprint on the magazine, but it wasn't enough for a match. With limited leads, the police issued a citywide alert. Officers combed the Back Bay district and beyond, searching for any trace of the suspect. But as the night stretched into dawn, the trail remained cold. Sergeant Detective James Fong, the lead investigator on the case, was determined to track down the man who had ambushed his fellow officers. When I got the call that Roy Surge and George Torres had been shot, I was stunned. The idea that someone would attack police officers so viciously, it was unthinkable, Fong later recalled. Despite his concern for his injured colleagues, Fong knew that the crime scene had to be handled like any other. A crime scene is a crime scene, whether the victims are officers or civilians. You have to approach it step by step, he explained. The first priority was to determine where the suspect had come from. If they could establish that, they might be able to identify him. Fong and his team focused on the area behind the building where the shooting had occurred. That's where Torres and Rogers had first spotted the suspect. Near the backyard gate, officers discovered a large air conditioning unit. Upon closer inspection, Fong noticed something critical: shoe prints. The prints were positioned in a way that suggested someone had used the unit to climb down from above. Directly above the unit was a third-floor hallway window. This guy didn't come from the street. He came from inside the building, Fong thought. That changed everything. If the suspect had been inside, it meant he was either a resident or had been visiting someone there. With that in mind, Fong and his team began questioning the building's tenants, specifically those of Asian descent, since the attacker was described as an Asian male. It was a logical starting point. The suspect was Asian, and he came from that building. That meant there was a good chance he either lived there or was connected to someone who did. Fong explained. A composite sketch of the shooter was created based on descriptions provided by the surviving officers. The detectives showed the sketch to the building's tenants, hoping someone would recognize him. But no one did. Although several residents admitted they had heard gunfire, none could provide any useful information about the suspect. I personally spoke with nearly everyone in the building, Fong said. Most people didn't even know their neighbors. Some had only been living there for a few weeks. It was a frustrating dead end. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Torres and Surge were still in critical condition, but had stabilized. Investigators were running out of leads, and the suspect had seemingly vanished. Then, a breakthrough. A few days after the shooting, the detectives received a call from someone with new information. The caller mentioned a tenant that had been overlooked, an Asian man who had suddenly gone missing. A property manager at the apartment complex confirmed that the tenant hadn't been seen all week. When police checked the records, they found the name Mark Terra. Terra's description was vague, but bore resemblance to the composite sketch. Armed with a search warrant, officers entered his apartment. Boston police. Open up. There was no response. Inside, the apartment was eerily clean and minimalistic, almost too neat. It looked like someone who had either been in the military or prison, one investigator noted. A closer search revealed something alarming. In a small box inside the apartment, detectives found 9mm ammunition, the same caliber used in the shooting. Get this photographed and logged. An officer instructed as crime scene text documented the discovery. Further analysis was needed, but the evidence was already starting to point in one direction. Then Fong noticed something else. A ceiling tile had been shifted out of place. When he checked, the space was empty, but it was clear that something had recently been hidden there. Whatever it was gone now. While searching for more clues, investigators found a rental agreement for Terra's apartment. Listed on the contract was a previous address, San Francisco, California. Fong immediately contacted the San Francisco police. "We need everything you have on a Mark Terra," he told them. A few hours later, they got a response. The San Francisco address belonged to a man named Leon Perry. Fong called the number listed on the rental paperwork, and a man answered. "Hello, this is Detective Fong with the Boston Police Department. I have a few questions." The voice on the other end hesitated. I don't know any Mark Terra." Fong pressed. "We're conducting an investigation involving 2 police officers who were shot in Boston. Your name came up as a possible contact." The hesitation turned into defensiveness. "Like I said, I don't know him." Something about Perry's tone didn't sit right with Fong. He was dodging the questions. "That told me he was hiding something," the detective recalled. San Francisco PD checked their records, but they had nothing on Perry. At least, not under that name. Then, another break. The Boston police received a fax from the San Francisco authorities. Attached were mugshots from an old case. When officers in Boston showed the photo lineup to Officer George Torres, the man who had been shot, his reaction was immediate. "The moment I saw it, I knew. That's him. That's the guy who shot me," Torres said. The name under the mugshot? Mark Terra. Except that wasn't his real name. A deeper dive into police records uncovered Terra's true identity. Ted Yukiyama, also known as Ted Suki. He was a career criminal with a history of violent offenses, including assaulting police officers. The investigation had taken a crucial turn. Now that they knew who they were looking for, they just had to find him. But Suki had already disappeared into thin air. With Ted Suki's real identity uncovered, the investigation shifted into high gear. He wasn't just some random criminal. He was a dangerous fugitive with a violent past. Boston police immediately issued an all-points bulletin for Suki, but by then he was already gone. The only lead? His San Francisco connection, Leon Perry. Boston detectives reached out to their counterparts in San Francisco for help. They needed to know more about Perry, where he lived, who he associated with, and most importantly, whether he had any recent contact with Suki. When San Francisco officers ran Perry's name, something interesting came up. Perry had no prior criminal record under his current name, but a deeper check revealed something unexpected. Years earlier, Perry had been incarcerated at Leavenworth Federal Prison. His cellmate? Ted Suki. That was it. The missing link. Perry had lied when he claimed not to know Suki. The 2 men had done time together. Armed with this information, Boston detectives flew to San Francisco to confront Perry in person. When they knocked on his door, Perry looked uneasy. "I told you, I don't know anything," he insisted. But when the officers showed him the mugshot of him and Suki together in prison, his face changed. "You were cellmates," an officer stated. "Now tell us the truth." Perry sighed, but he still refused to cooperate. "I haven't seen him in months." Boston detectives weren't buying it. With no legal grounds to arrest him, they decided on a different tactic: surveillance. If Perry was helping Suki, he'd eventually slip up, and he did. 2 days later, investigators spotted Perry driving a car registered to Suki. That was enough to bring him in for questioning. At the police station, officers laid out their case. "You're driving Suki's car," an investigator said. "You were cellmates. He's a fugitive. If you're helping him, that makes you an accomplice." Perry panicked. "I didn't help him escape," he blurted out. That was enough to keep pressing him. Under pressure, Perry finally admitted that Suki had contacted him after the shooting in Boston. "He called me the day after it happened," Perry confessed. He was freaking out, said things went bad. According to Perry, Suki told him he had shot 2 cops and needed to get out of town, fast. He was calling from a payphone at the Dayton, Ohio airport. Perry revealed that was a game changer. Until now, investigators had no idea where Suki had gone. Now they knew he was in Ohio. Perry also admitted that Suki left his car and the gun he used in the shooting at the airport. "I was supposed to go to Dayton, pick up the car, and get rid of the gun," Perry said. Instead, he kept the gun, a 9mm SIG Sauer, the same type of weapon used in the shooting. When police searched Perry's residence, they found the murder weapon hidden inside a box. Ballistics confirmed it. It was a gun that shot Torres and Serge, an investigator later said. That alone was enough to charge Perry as an accomplice after the fact. But more importantly, police now had something huge. Suki's gun had his fingerprints on a live round inside the magazine. This was the proof we needed to tie him directly to the shooting, one officer said. But there was still one big problem. Suki was still out there. And now, the FBI was getting involved. With Suki officially identified, the FBI took over the case. On January 22, 1988, the agency placed him on its list of the 10 most wanted fugitives. This meant one thing. Every law enforcement agency in the country was now looking for him. To increase the chances of catching him, the FBI arranged for Suki's story to be featured on a nationally televised crime show. It was a long shot, but sometimes the public provided crucial tips. And sure enough, it worked. That night, a tipster called the FBI hotline. "I know someone close to Suki," the caller said. The tipster revealed that Suki had family in Texas and had been in contact with them recently. "If anyone knows where he is, it's them," the caller insisted. This was huge. The last known location investigators had was Dayton, Ohio, but this tip suggested Suki might have fled to Texas. The FBI immediately checked the family's phone records. What they found changed everything. Suki's relatives in Texas had recently received multiple calls from a number in Mexico, specifically from Guadalajara. That was the break they needed. Now, the case was no longer just national. It had become international. Since the FBI did not have jurisdiction in Mexico, they had to work with Mexican authorities. Special Agent Stephen Walker, the FBI's legal attaché in Mexico, took the lead. "In cases like this, we rely on our local law enforcement partners," Walker later said. "We can't just go in and make arrests. We have to do things by the book." The first step? Finding Suki's exact location. Investigators had the Mexican phone number he was calling from. Now they needed to trace it. Mexican authorities worked on tracking the number to a physical address. Meanwhile, the FBI formulated a plan to lure Suki out of hiding. They turned to Leon Perry once again. Since Perry was already cooperating, the FBI gave him a secret mission. He would pretend to be planning an escape from the U.S. and reach out to Suki's family for help. The goal? To make them contact Suki and arrange a meeting. The operation was risky, but Perry agreed. Suki's relatives took the bait. They agreed to meet Perry in Matamoros, Mexico, a city near the Texas border. Unbeknownst to them, FBI agents, Boston detectives, and Mexican federal police were all watching. The moment Perry sat down with them, authorities were listening. At first, the conversation was vague. Then, Perry pressed harder. "I need to talk to Suki," he said. "Where is he?" One of the relatives hesitated. "He's not in this area." That wasn't good enough. "If I'm supposed to help him, I need to know where he is," Perry insisted. Finally, they cracked. "We can't tell you the exact location," one relative admitted, "but he's in Guadalajara." That was confirmation. Suki was definitely hiding in Guadalajara. Mexican authorities moved fast. Within hours, they traced a phone number to an apartment complex in the city. For 2 days, agents watched the building. Then, they got what they were waiting for. Ted Suki appeared. On the morning of February 6, 1988, Mexican federal police moved in. Suki tried to flee, but he didn't get far. This time, he had no escape. After months on the run, the man who had ambushed Boston police officers was finally in custody. He was extradited to the U.S. and convicted of murder, attempted murder, and multiple other charges. The sentence? Life in prison, plus 20 additional years. Justice had finally been served. With Suki behind bars, investigators could finally piece together the full extent of his crimes. What they discovered painted a chilling picture of a man who was far more dangerous than they had initially realized. Long before the shooting in Boston, Suki had already built a violent reputation. His criminal history stretched back to the late 1970s, when he was involved in armed robberies and assaults. But his most brazen act before the Boston attack happened in Texas in 1979. Back then, Suki had been part of a carefully planned heist. He and his crew had overpowered 2 police officers inside a small town station in Los Fresnos. After neutralizing the officers and destroying their communications equipment, Suki led his team across the street to a bank, where they stormed inside and stole $70,000. Despite his efforts to disappear, authorities eventually caught up with him, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, Suki didn't serve the full sentence. He was released after 7 years on parole. Not long after that, he violated his parole by leaving Texas, making him a wanted fugitive once again. This is where his story became even more disturbing. While investigators in Boston were still processing evidence from the police shooting, they uncovered something unexpected. In Suki's abandoned apartment, they found several pieces of unusual electronic equipment. Initially, they weren't sure what to make of it, but when the FBI's bomb squad examined the items, they came to a shocking conclusion. Suki had been working on homemade bombs. Further investigation revealed that he had been planning a major bank heist, one even more elaborate than his 1979 robbery. This time, the plan was terrifying. Suki and his crew had developed remotely detonated explosive devices disguised as briefcases. The idea was to kidnap a bank manager, cuff the briefcase to their wrist, and force them to rob their own bank. Once the money was secured, the bomb would be remotely detonated to eliminate the witness. One of Suki's former associates, a convicted bank robber in Minnesota, confirmed these details. He told the FBI that Suki had recruited skilled criminals and had even sought out bomb makers to help execute his plan. People come up with crazy ideas all the time, one FBI agent later said. But Suki wasn't just talking. He was actually putting the pieces together to make it happen. With this new information, authorities needed proof. If Suki had built functioning bombs, there had to be evidence somewhere. The break came when a San Francisco informant told them about a storage unit Suki had rented. FBI agents and bomb technicians moved in carefully. Inside, they found several explosive devices, all rigged with remote detonation triggers. To confirm their suspicions, bomb technicians conducted a controlled detonation. The results were terrifying. The bombs were highly effective, capable of causing mass destruction in close quarters. The FBI concluded that if Suki had gone through with his plan, the casualties could have been catastrophic. With this overwhelming evidence, investigators had enough to charge Suki with even more crimes, including conspiracy to commit robbery and use of explosive devices and a crime of violence. But there was still one lingering question. Had Leon Perry known about the bombs? FBI agents brought Perry in for another round of questioning. This time, they had something new. Lab results from the bomb packaging. Perry's fingerprints were on the materials. I didn't know what he was planning, Perry insisted. If I did, I would have told you guys. But investigators weren't convinced. They revoked Perry's parole and arrested him for aiding and abetting a fugitive. At this point, Perry realized he had no choice. Facing up to 20 years in prison, he agreed to fully cooperate. For the next week, FBI agents interrogated him relentlessly, pressing for every last detail about Suki's criminal network. Eventually, Perry gave up everything he knew. He provided details about Suki's escape route, the people who helped him, and the places he might have hidden money. One revelation stood out. Suki had connections in Mexico that could have helped him flee even further. This was crucial information because it explained how Suki had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement for so long. By the time all the pieces came together, investigators realized something terrifying. Suki had been one step away from launching a crime spree that could have resulted in multiple murders. Thanks to the relentless pursuit by law enforcement, his plans were stopped before they could be carried out. Suki's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming, and it didn't take long for the jury to find him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 20 years for the bomb plot. Meanwhile, Officer George Torres recovered from his injuries and eventually returned to duty. He later retired in 1997. Roy Surge, the officer who had died from his wounds, was posthumously promoted to detective. The Boston Police Department honored his sacrifice by naming a briefing room after him. For those involved in the case, Suki's capture wasn't just about justice. It was about preventing an even greater tragedy. After the shooting, the Boston Police Department changed its policies. Officers were now equipped with bulletproof vests and higher-capacity weapons, making sure they were better prepared for future confrontations. Torres, reflecting on the entire case, summed it up best. "There's no such thing as a routine call," he said. "That night proved it. We have to be ready for anything, because you never know what's waiting on the other side of that door." Even though Suki was behind bars, the FBI wasn't finished. His arrest had been a major victory, but investigators still had unanswered questions, especially about the network of people who had helped him stay on the run for so long. The fugitive had spent months evading capture, moving from Boston to Ohio, then Texas, and finally Mexico. He had no legitimate income, no steady job, yet he had managed to secure housing, transportation, and even an escape route. That meant one thing. He had help. Leon Perry had already confessed to assisting Suki, but he wasn't the only one. The FBI suspected Suki had a larger support system, possibly linked to organized crime. They started by tracing his finances. Since Suki had been living off the grid, he wasn't using bank accounts or credit cards. Instead, he relied on cash transactions and fake IDs. One by one, the FBI tracked down people who had given him money, provided shelter, or helped him move between locations. One lead stood out, a former cellmate from Leavenworth who had made multiple large cash withdrawals around the time Suki was hiding in Mexico. Agents brought the man in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, but when confronted with bank records and phone call logs connecting him to Suki, he cracked. "He called me a few days after the Boston shooting." The man admitted. He said he was in trouble and needed cash to get out of the country. The suspect revealed that Suki had used a network of ex-convicts to help finance his escape. The FBI followed the money trail, leading them to a stash house in Houston, Texas. Inside, agents found fake IDs, burner phones, and nearly $50,000 in cash, money that had likely been used to keep Suki afloat. But the biggest discovery was a map of Mexico, with certain locations circled in red ink. One of those locations, Guadalajara, the very place where Suki had been hiding. This was further proof that Suki's escape had been carefully planned, and that others had played a role in keeping him hidden. One by one, the FBI tracked down and arrested Suki's associates. Some were charged with harboring a fugitive, while others faced conspiracy charges. The final piece of the puzzle came when investigators discovered a weapon supplier in Texas who had sold Suki the 9mm SIG Sauer pistol used in the Boston shooting. The supplier, a known arms dealer with ties to criminal organizations, was already under investigation for illegally selling firearms to fugitives. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he agreed to testify. His testimony provided key details about Suki's criminal connections, revealing that Suki had been in contact with multiple violent offenders in the months leading up to the shooting. By the time the investigation wrapped up, more than a dozen people had been charged for their roles in aiding Suki. For the FBI, it wasn't just about holding them accountable. It was about sending a message. "People like Suki don't survive on their own," one agent later said. "They rely on others to keep them hidden. Our job is to make sure that doesn't happen." As the years passed, Suki's case became a cautionary tale within law enforcement. His ability to evade capture for so long was a wake-up call about the need for better coordination between agencies. Boston police officers, once limited to 6-shot revolvers, were now equipped with semi-automatic pistols. Body armor became mandatory for all officers on duty. The memory of Roy Surge's sacrifice remained a driving force for change within the department. His name was etched into Boston's law enforcement history, a reminder of the dangers officers face every day. And as for Ted Suki, he would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, never again a threat to the public. But for those who had chased him across states, countries, and years, the case was more than just an arrest. It was proof that justice, no matter how long it takes, always catches up.